On behalf of FOSI committee, it is my pleasure to welcome you here today in FOSI online talk series. I hope you enjoy your dinner already and ready to hear an impressive presentation from Han later on. Amid this COVID-19 outbreak situation, hope everybody doing well. Stay at home and keep physical distancing. I would like to extend my gratitude to our sponsors of Noble Energy Resources and Geoscience Delta Andalan for funding of this Zoom platform. With us together, already joined the FOSI committee, Mas Ricky, our General FOSI Secretary, and then Pak Herman, our advisor, and the rest will joining us soon. We also have, later on, we'll have Bob Morley to join us, Peter Lan, and then Peter Woodruff. Glad to know you would like to join us tonight. We're glad to inform you that we established the FOSI YouTube channel. We uploaded the all videos from previous talk already. And don't forget to subscribe and like the channel and please enjoy the video. Definitely, today's talk will be uploaded as well. I would like to thank you for joining us today for this special presentation on pioneers and milestones of Indonesian geology. Who were they? Where did they come from? What were they thinking? And get ready to be excited on a brave journey across the rich history of geoscience discovery in the Indonesian region from 18th until the mid-19th. It will be a somewhat light series of stories with a focus on the people that were instrumental in the geological discoveries with lots of pretty pictures. Moving right along, it is now my pleasure to introduce our guest speaker, really honored to have Han van Gorsel, retired ExxonMobil Houston, USA. Thank you very much for sparing your time for us, Han. Many thanks once again. I believe most of you know him very well, met him, or maybe already have his book with the title of Bibliography of Indonesian Geology and Surrounding Areas. The soft copy also available now. Well, before I hand over to Han, please allow me to give you some rules in order to make this meeting running smoothly. I would like to get your attention for a moment. First, I recommend all participants to mute the audio and switch off your video during explanation from presenter to maintain a good connection. Second, the presentation may be recorded for a rescreening within the FOSI platform. Last but not least, a Q&A box can be found in the icons panel, usually at the bottom of your screen. Enter your name for the committee to collect after the presentation. It will be answered live by Han later on, and you might turn on your audio or video to deliver your question. Hope everybody happy with that. If so many questions arise, we might have a short break, but this is very flexible. Let's see how it goes later on. So, well, ladies and gentlemen, enjoy the talk and please welcome Han van Gorsel. Yes, Han, this is your time.
Okay, thank you, Melissa. Welcome to my talk from Houston, where we're in the middle of another peak of coronavirus. We have now all new records, so go Texas and the USA. We are #1 again. On that note, I just woke up and clearly that didn't help with the technical issues here. I cannot see you, but I suspect I know many of you already. And for those you do not know me, I'm a Dutch geologist and micropaleontologist, studied in Amsterdam, worked most of my career for ExxonMobil as a petroleum geologist and micropaleontologist. I lived in Jakarta for about 12 years at different occasions in the 70s and 80s. And it's become my sort of second home. I had plans to visit around this time or maybe September, but that's clearly not going to happen. So this presentation is a nice replacement for doing that and remain somewhat in contact. So after retiring about 10 years ago, I spent a lot of time doing what I call Indonesia hobby geology. And one of the products of that is my bibliography that many of you may have seen, which is now over 20 2,800 pages. And during my career, I built a large collection of historic geologic literature from Indonesia. And I've always been impressed with the quality of much of the work that was done and with the difficult circumstances under which a lot of that material was acquired, and of a lot of the pretty pictures that are in these books. So, at the same time, with dealing with much of the younger people, it seemed that they were not very well known with their own history, especially the pre-World War II stuff. So I'm trying this presentation as a vehicle to show you, to run through a bunch of pretty pictures, to keep it fairly light, and see what all is out there for things that you may want to look at if you can. So right here, the opening picture is one of the first pictures from the 1800s. Some of you may recognize this is a somewhat distorted version of Bromo and the little cone next to it in East Java. And one thing to characterize the olden days is, well, no, I should go through this first. During the Dutch colonial era, now there's been about 1,000 geologists, over 1,000, and mining engineers that spent parts of or all of their career in the Netherlands Indies, either as geological survey or for oil or mining companies, or they came as academic researchers or independent prospectors. And a lot of these people had doctorates from the top European universities of that time. They were not just graduate students coming for a degree and then never be seen again. But since Holland, Indonesia was a Dutch colony, and the Netherlands is a country of sand and clay. So in the 1800s, there were no geologists. There was no need for any of that in the Netherlands. So when the need arose for geologists in the Indies, a lot of the geologists that first came were actually German or Swiss or other nationalities. And there were a lot of interesting characters. There are lots of stories that we could tell. But as I was putting this together, it's probably this is enough material for a 2-day course, and obviously we don't have that kind of time. So we're just gonna have to motor pretty good here. So we can recognize 4 stages. Now, before 1800, there was nothing. The Dutch that came, they were just traders, mostly uneducated. They came to buy their goods and create some havoc here and there and left. There was no science. Then in the early 1800s, some of the early naturalists started to go around and actually study nature, and that it was not restricted to rocks, but also, botany, zoology. They looked at everything. Then in 1850, we opened the Geological Survey, what is now the Geological Survey. It was the Bureau of Mines, the Dienst van het Mijnwezen. And these early people were just chasing opportunities for economic developments. So basically, they were sort of checking out places where minerals or coal kind of had already been found and evaluating it and not coming up with a whole lot of results. And also, they did not do a lot of geology. They were mining engineers primarily. And it was not until the late 1800s and the early 1900s that we've seen a significant expansion of mapping and geologic studies. And of course, the economic depression of the 1930s killed a lot of that, or at least slowed it down. But the period from 1900 to 1940 is the thing that has been most productive. And on the curve of number of publications, it's this bump here that we are going to talk about most of the time. It's what happened between 1900 and 1940. And then we go into a bit of the dark decades from 1940 to 1970, where almost nothing was going on. And then we come into the modern area that I'll leave for somebody else to talk about. So some of you may have seen this. Now, this is the bibliography that I could put together, this printed version. So we get almost 24,000 titles. And for a lot of you, it's like, well, you may be asking who were those people that wrote all these papers? Where did they come from and all? And so that's kind of when I was presenting this work in Jakarta and Jogja last year, or a year and a half ago, several people asked me, well, why don't you write something down on this? And I was like, well, I could, because if I don't do it, maybe nobody else will. And that turned out to be, that this took me for the rest of a year or a year and a half to what started out as maybe an extended paper. And then it became, gee, it's more like a book right now. And now it's grown into what you're looking at here. Now I have 4 volumes that total about 1,200 pages of rough drafts. And I'm kind of going to follow the contents of these books in progress for my talk. So there's the first one is the early scientific explorers. Then there's this volume 2 is about the geological survey, volcanology. Then there's a volume on paleontologists and other specialists, and one on mining, petroleum and mining. So, and this this is kind of the list of contacts. I'm in this book. I'm summarizing the lives and times of about 200 people, like 3-4 page write-ups, and these are all the names that I'm talking about. And of course, there is way too much for you to look at. But we'll go through this in a little more. So here is volume 2. These are all the characters that came through the geological survey. These are some of the main characters that did volcanology. And here is a whole slew of paleontologists. In the early 1900s was sort of a peak time of macro paleontological monographs that are absolutely spectacular, a lot of them. Micropaleontology followed shortly thereafter, and then we had the mammals and hominid people doing their things at the same time. And finally, there is a volume on mining. Now, these are the early petroleum entrepreneurs, some of the petroleum geologists and the miners. Problem with the industry people is they did fantastic work, a lot of them, but almost a very small fraction of that work was ever published. So I should have mentioned, highlighted in orange, in the orange color are the ones I'm going to talk about in a bit more detail. I don't know if you'll be able to see that. So start from the beginning. In the very early days, there were no geologists. Geology hardly existed, and certainly not in the Netherlands. So what did come was a series of naturalists. Now they were bits of everything. They did botany, zoology, and they also looked at rocks periodically. Here in the background is one of their early maps of the Kelud volcano, and the deposits of its the 1822 eruption that are sort of carry on right here. So these people were learning about all this exotic nature of Indonesia and describing everything they could find on the wonderful world. So the very first guy, and he was kind of a lone soul. He was a merchant for the Dutch East Indies Company. He was Rumphius. He was a German that was in Ambon, and he probably had a lot of time on his hands. And he set out to describe everything he could see in the nature around him, and wrote some classic books around 1700s about shells and crabs and minerals and rocks. And he was actually the first one to describe, some fossils from the area, including some belemnites from the Sula Islands. But when he died around 1700, it was pretty much over for another more than 100 years. No, there was no science being done until, and I hate to say it, the British came. When Holland was occupied by the French in around 1800, the English thought that this was a good time to take over the colony of the Netherlands Indies. So they invaded Java, appointed Mr. Raffles as governor. And Raffles, in addition to being an empire building, he was also very interested in nature, and he kind of set the tone for the study of the people and the environment of Java with this big tome. It's a lot of it is nature. There is not a whole lot of rocks, but there's some beautiful depictions of what Java looked like in those days. And a lot of you probably recognize this as Gunung Gede. We used to see this out of the window in our office in Jakarta in the 70s and 80s, but I don't think you see it very often anymore. This is Bogor. Here is the Raffles, the monument for Raffles's wife who died while he was there in what is now the Botanical Gardens. And all the sprawl of Bogor has not arrived yet, obviously. So Raffles had some help with his Java tome in the form of this gentleman. He was Thomas Horsfield. He's an American medical doctor, but like many medical doctors at that time, they were more interested in looking at nature, than treating patients, and he was one of them. And he actually produced one of the first crude geologic maps of Java, which is this thing here. And he was kind of responsible for the impression that a lot of people got since then, that Java was essentially all volcanic rocks with not a whole lot of other things. So after the British left, and after Napoleon was defeated, and Holland got its colony back, the Dutch king decided that it was time that the Dutch were trying to do some science of their own. So they formed this Natural History Commission, the Natuurkundige Commissie, and they were recruiting a bunch of naturalist explorers, sort of in the tradition of Darwin and Alexander von Humboldt, who would go out and study the natural world of the Netherlands Indies and collect animals, plants, rocks, everything, mainly for the Natural History Museum and the Botanical Gardens in Leiden. And in the process, they were asked to keep out an eye out for potential mineral and coal deposits. And one of the persons that was instrumental in creating this was a Caspar Reinbart, another German. So it was kind of a mixed success, this whole commission. They sent out 18 members. Now, these were explorers that were sent out for theoretically a 4 or 5 year period. And then during that time, they were supposed to study and collect as much as they could, not spend much time on working out their data, but then take everything back to the Netherlands and then spend a couple of years at the Leiden Museum to work out their results. The problem with this is that 12 out of the 18 members died before they could return to the Netherlands. So, and with them, in many cases, they lost a lot of their samples, they lost a lot of their notes. So there was a lot of waste And by 1850s, they decided it was no longer worth the investment, and they stopped the commission. At the same time, here's a little picture of some of the dead people. These are two young naturalists that died on Java, mostly from disease, and one of them actually had been attacked by a rhinoceros. This guy died in an uprising of Chinese laborers in near Karawang, and many others just died from disease as they went. You probably all realize that they went out. They didn't fly, into the field area and took a jeep to get there. They had to take boats, and they had to walk, and they had to make their own maps, and their medical supplies were very primitive. So, and there was a lot more dangerous wildlife there than there is now. So these guys had a pretty rough task. So here's one of these early Dutch naturalists was Mr. Reinwart. He was primarily a botanist, and he was a professor of natural history in what was called the Atheneum Illustri, which later became the University of Amsterdam. And he became director for agriculture, arts, and sciences in the Netherlands Indies right after the British left. And he did several good things. Now, he founded the Bogor Botanical Gardens and set up some other science programs. But one of the things that he got as a reward before returning, he was allowed to do an East Indonesia expedition and play his own Alexander von Humboldt routine here. So there's some spectacular pictures that he came up with from his trip. Here he pictures a gold mine in Gorontalo. This is in North Sulawesi. There was already a lot of native gold mining across Indonesia, especially in North Sulawesi and Sumatra. And here is one of those mine workings in 1822. A lot of you probably recognize this little monument for Mr. Reinwart in the Botanical Gardens in Bogor. So here's another example of, how these early guys went around and marveled at the wonders, the exotic wonders of Indonesia. Here is the crater of a volcano, which they didn't use the word volcano at that time. They call it fire mountains, which is kind of what Indonesians still do too. Gunung Api. Another one of the naturalists that he was one of the few that actually came back and documented his results was Salomon Miller, a German naturalist. He traveled Java, Borneo, Sumatra, everywhere, and wrote big reports on his travels. He's significant for two things. One is, now you're all familiar with the Wallace Line. It's a zoological boundary which separates Asian faunas in the western Indonesia from mostly Australian type faunas in the east. And he pretty much described this before actually naming it. And then Englishman Wallace, who got credited with discovering these zoological provinces, now he sort of got the credit for it. The other thing he was good for, he did find the coal deposits in Southeast Kalimantan, which would be explored fairly soon afterwards, and he reported on gold and copper on Timor, which was correct but never resulted into any commercial exploitation. Again, these people, this is the time before photography. And if these people wanted to illustrate something, they had to make sketches, which then often when they came home, they had professional artists turn them into these beautiful engravings and paintings. And here is an example of the crater of Gunung Gede in West Java. Some of you probably climbed this. I've been up here, probably a half dozen times when I was much younger. Some more pictures from Mr. Salomon Miller. Here is his book on his travels in Sumatra in 1833, 1838 with Horner. Horner got sick and died during this adventure. One of the interesting things he described were the gold mines in Salida in West Sumatra. This was actually a mining operation that the Dutch East Indies Company had started in the 1700s. Now using German miners and slaves, and there's all sorts of dramatic stories that go with this that we do not have time to talk about. But there's still remnants of the VOC mines were there in 1844, and obviously there's still a lot of native gold mining going on there as well. It's just a little map. So this is the west coast of Sumatra, the Salida Bay, and the mines are here. So some of it is, interesting documentation of what these guys were discovering. So another little smaller products from the from around 1840. This is the first attempt of a geologic map of Timor, and they had already identified Jurassic limestones and Triassic limestones, metamorphic rocks. So it's very crude, but they're starting to see things that weren't known before. A lot of this all early naturalist stuff is of limited importance right now. It's because it's the very first time they observed a lot of things. But what is good about some of them is that they documented the situation as it was in the early 1800s, and these situations may no longer exist today, and therefore their descriptions are useful from that respect. So here, this is based on a sketch from Muller in the what Krakatau looked like in 1836. Of course, most of this mountain blew up in 1883, but here's a view of what it looked like before then. Another big name among the naturalists was Schwanner. He's also known for the Schwanner Range in Borneo. He was the first European to complete an overland traverse from Banjarmasin in the west to the southeast. He went from Banjarmasin in the southeast to Pontianak on the west coast in 1848. He also found some more coal deposits. He actually found the deposits that would later lead to the Pengaron coal mine. However, he was another one of these guys that died of malaria before he documented stuff. So he had somebody else take his notes and actually record much of it. There's a plaque commemorating Schwanner in his hometown in Germany. So there are lots of pretty pictures. Here's one from Schwanner. It shows limestones, probably tertiary limestones on the Barito River area in Borneo. We're getting a bit more scientific with the arrival of Junghun. And I'm sure all of you have heard of him. He was another German who came to the Netherlands as a medical doctor, but then he finagled that to become a member of the Natural History Commission. After a couple of years, he traveled extensively across Java and Sumatra, and he's always been nicknamed the Humboldt of Java, was, because of his descriptions of the natural world of Java. And there's probably more books written about Junghun than about any other naturalist or geologist in Indonesia. And I'm sure you're familiar with some of that. Here is his major tome on Java, 3 volumes, lots of pictures, lots of maps. He personally climbed and described all 37 active volcanoes. He also dispelled the earlier notion that Horsfield had created, that Java was almost all volcanic. There is actually a lot more. There are a lot of widespread tertiary sediments that I'm sure you all know. Spectacular engravings that came out of there that you've probably all seen in various places. This is the crater of Guntur, just one example. This is a picture I always liked, in that it's another one from Junghun, where he depicts a place called Gunung Gamping. It's west of Yogyakarta. It's kind of an idyllic limestone mountain. And this is kind of what it looked like in 1840. And this is an example of something that no longer exists. That there's just I think there's just a little stump of one of these things still standing there. And I think now we have Peter Lunt attending here. Peter actually documented some of the biostratigraphy of this thing. It had been known to be that there are Eocene larger foraminifera in this limestone. There's also some Miocene associated with it. But now, one point to make here is a lot of things that used to exist and are of interest to now the geologic picture no longer exists, and limestones are one of the victims of sort of widespread quarrying and turning into cement. Now a lot of important geological information has gone in into making cement all over a lot of places in Indonesia. Here is probably the earliest photograph of an outcrop. This was also made by Junghun many years later. And this is now Gunung Gamping again, pretty much in its natural state. And as I said, it no longer looks like this today. Here's another, this is another example of Junghun's thing. He was commissioned to do a detailed photographic map of Java, and it's a spectacular looking map. And this is just a small part of it. So Junghun went home with his, with his reports and his data, and wrote his books in the Netherlands for a couple of years. Then he managed to return to Java, and you're probably aware of that story. And he was charged with developing quinine plantations, this is medicine for malaria in West Java, and he settled in Lembang near Bandung. And this is where he died and is buried. There was a grave monument erected for him in 1864, 1865. And this is another situation that if you go there today, you would not recognize it. It's all built in, and it's been, it's been rebuilt a few times, but it looked very idyllic in the Junghun days. Here's a little side guy who not many of you will associate with naturalists, but this is Raden Saleh. He's a Javanese. He's a famous Javanese painter who painted in a romantic style. He spent many years in Europe, and he painted portraits of European noble families and rich people. And but eventually he came back to Java, and he developed into a bit of a naturalist. He painted volcanoes, and he had found out about localities with Pleistocene mammal fossils, big bones. And some of the people were actually collecting them already, and they're being ground up for medicines. But he managed to build a rather significant collection that he then gave to the Batavian Society of Sciences. And now a lot of it eventually ended up in Leiden and been described by old Professor Martin. And this is some of the material that Raden Saleh actually collected in Central Java from localities that would later be some of the key localities for hominid and mammal localities in Java. So now he was so fascinating by volcanoes. Here is he painted the eruption of Merapi volcano, 1865. This is during the day, and then the same angle at night. Now these are spectacular paintings. It looks like perhaps there's been some artistic license, but they're pretty. They're pretty to look at, and they have been used by volcanological studies interpreting the nature of the 1865 eruption, because he was the only one that recorded it in this way. Another interesting little side character was, again, a medical doctor who was supposed to be treating soldiers in Borneo, but spent more time looking at rocks. He's Theodore or Tifadar Posovic, a Hungarian, but he in addition to his medical degree, he had a degree from the famous mining academy in Freiburg in Saxony. So he took a lot of time to look at rocks in Borneo, and some of it was the very first work from that area. So he talks about gold occurrences. He also about diamonds in Borneo, and he also looked at tin deposits in Bangka. He was actually the first courageous soul to make a geologic map of Borneo, of the entire island. And of course, the current map doesn't quite look like this anymore. But his impression was that there were a series of ridges of metamorphic and igneous rocks, and then there was tertiary and younger sediments that were sort of folded up against it. And this kind of situation is kind of what you do see in the Marathas range out here, but it does not really apply to any of those other ridges. This is one of the first maps that I'm aware of that shows where the diamond fields of Borneo are. This was a significant industry from for hundreds of years, and a lot of it's all been native mining, but also Chinese had come out in the late 1700s or 1800s. And these are the main areas in which they occur. But it's fairly widespread. No, it's both in West and Southeast Kalimantan, and people are still debating where these things actually come from. And 10 years later, he made a slightly better map of Borneo. This is still Posovic, a Hungarian friend, and in the process, this is part of a book that he wrote on Borneo geology, the very first one, and which was actually published in 1892 and 1889, in German, and then translated and published in 1892. So it's interesting. The next, so this is pretty much for the naturalists and accidental geologists from the 1800s. Around 1900s, people getting a bit more serious in mounting actual geographic expeditions to Indonesia, and a lot of them are East Indonesia and New Guinea. Here is a, so I'm quickly going to roll through some of them. Here's a picture of a mining engineer Heldring in 1907, who went out with one of the geographic expeditions to the south coast of New Guinea. And here are, there's a lot of words that we're not going to go through, but there was this flurry of activity around 1900s. Mr. Volz went to Sumatra. You get these characters, Wichmann, Verbeek, a bunch of German academics. They traipsed around eastern Indonesian islands. Molengraaf, he crossed Kalimantan in the late 1800s. Several Germans and Swiss and Dutch traipsed around in Sulawesi. Then there was, some famous Timor expeditions by Banner and Molengraaf in 1912, 1911. And there's a whole slew of New Guinea expeditions. So as I said before, most of these early guys were German and Swiss, but in the very late 1800s, we're starting to see more and more Dutch geologists getting involved. And part of the reason there is that they finally started to institute some geology programs in the Netherlands. So they appointed geology professors in Leiden, that was Karl Martin, in Groningen, and in Utrecht, it was Wichmann. And also they started become more serious in the Technische Hogeschool in Delft, which was the source of all the mining engineers in the Netherlands Indies, by appointing an actual geology professor, Vogelsang. He was a young German that is not very well known, but I think he's more significant than people give him. He was only in Delft for maybe 10 years, and then he died. But he did make a clear difference in the caliber of the mining engineers that were sent to Indonesia after that. Some of his students were Verbeek, Venema, Hose, and these guys obviously came with a lot more geological baggage than anything that had come before, and also even the guys that came after Verbeek and all, they suddenly reverted to not being much of geologists. And part of the reason is they didn't have a geology professor in Delft right after Vogelsang died and before Molengraaf came to fill that role in 1905. So we probably have to motor a little bit here. This is the kind of conditions that these people are in 1913 New Guinea expedition. This Hubrecht, he's an interesting character. He participated in 3 expeditions in New Guinea, and he managed to climb the snow-covered peaks of the Wilhelmina in the Central Range from 2 sides, one on a trek from the north coast and one on a trek from the south coast. So he walked through the entire island in the very early 1900s, which was quite a feat in itself. Here's an interesting character, Wilhelm Volz. He is a German, and he went on 3 expeditions in North Sumatra, published quite a bit about it. Two of his expeditions were mostly academic and ethnographic, and one of them was actually sponsored by a Dutch industrialist who spent a lot of time and money and looked for opportunities in the Netherlands. It is very little known, but an interesting character by itself, because August Janssen. So this is some of Volz's, one of Volz's major works on the geology of Sumatra. Some of his wild cross sections. He said, a dapper-looking man. He got cleaned up apparently from his field work and had himself photographed in Medan. This is him looking a little more disheveled in the field in Sumatra. This is a typical fly camp, and he did come up with some things that were new at the time. So, he documented the presence of Triassic marine rocks in North Sumatra with these mollusks. There was Permian fusellinids in this limestone. This is a name that is still being used in fusellinid zonations in Southeast Asia and the Himalayas and what have you. So he also embarked on a tectonic scheme, and this is a point to make here, is that a lot of that old literature is very good as long as they stick to descriptions. Now, if they say there is black shale in this bend of the river and it has Jurassic fossils, okay, that is information that never goes bad. Once they start doing big scale tectonic stuff, a lot of it goes bad in a hurry. So now here is Volz's interpretation of the major structural trends in Indonesia, and these are a bunch of lines that don't seem to have a basis in much of anything that I can tell, but it was a nice effort. One of the big names, and he's definitely in my top 5 of most significant geologists to have traipsed around Indonesia, was Gustav Molengraaf. He's a Dutch geology professor, and he also spent some time as the state geologist in South Africa and what have you. His main significance for the Indonesia is his expedition in central Borneo. He was the first true geologist that trekked from the west coast in Pontianak to the southeast coast, and wrote this spectacular report on the geology on the way. So here he's seen in the field with some of his Dayak guides, I suppose. So this book was the expedition was in 1894. He was out in the field for 9 or 10 months, and this was published in 1900 in Dutch, unfortunately for some of you. So here's some pictures from his trek. Here's one of his camps, an overhanging limestone rock. A lot of the transportation was along the rivers, and they had a bunch of canoes, and there were rapids, and it was a rather adventurous trip, and it's kind of a miracle that everybody on that trip came back in one piece and relatively unharmed. One of the more significant things that Molengraaf did on that expedition, he changed the. People looked at Borneo as now there are no active volcanoes, there are no earthquakes to speak of, and it looks like a big tired old piece of continent. But what he notices is there are these zones here that are typical oceanic rocks. Now this is the Mesozoic, what he called Danau Formation. It's the radiolarites and what he recognized as typical oceanic sediments, intensely folded. So this in those days that was a head scratcher. How do you get these things in the middle of? This obvious records of ancient oceanic sediments and ancient volcanism in the middle of this continent. He was also important for organizing the Timor Expedition in 1911, and this was mostly triggered by there was a German geologist. He was a BPM geologist, but he spent a lot of his own time and money to traipse around eastern Indonesian islands. And he and his friends were going to mount a Timor expedition and collect some of the fossils that he knew were out there. When the Dutch heard of this, they decided we can't let the Germans take all the credit for what's going to be interesting discovery. So they mounted an expedition of their own around the same time. Fortunately, they got together and said, well, why don't we stick to the eastern half and Wanner sticks to the western part. And in the end, we combine all the fossil finds and then we find a way to describe them. It was a wonderful cooperative effort that spawned incredible amounts of good geologic and paleontological work. Molengraaf, like many others after him, these people had, these European geologists, they all go through the Alps and they've seen all the big NAP systems and they interpret, Molengraaf interpreted Timor as being, a fault belt that had these big overthrusts that have been transported for probably hundreds of kilometers over unrelated rocks. And this is still a model that's being debated for Timor. It has kind of fallen out of fashion, but I'm not quite sure if that is completely justified. And so it's interesting to see how these guys looked at it. Here's a picture of Molengraaf later in life when he was the big professor in Delft. He was kind of a big thinker and a big picture guy, and came up with some a whole series of interesting ideas. One was on the distribution of oil and gas fields in the Netherlands Indies, and he noticed that all the oil and gas field, the oil-bearing basins known at that time, which are shown in black here, they were all neogene basins at the edge of the Sundaland Craton, which we all know that now, but at that time it was still kind of new thinking. What he then proceeded to do is, he said, well, there are areas in between, like central Sumatra and northwest Java that are basinal areas, but the oil has not yet been established. And his prediction was that they should go look in those places. And of course, these have now become into two of the most important petroleum basins in Indonesia since then. This picture you may have seen several times before. The Sunda Shelf is traversed by a series of incised valleys, and he had a friend who was a freshwater fish guy, and they noticed that the fish in the rivers here in Sumatra and the fish in the rivers in West Borneo were closely related. Whereas this is freshwater fish, they're not able to cross the sea, or not easily anyway. And he correctly interpreted as saying that, well, during the Pleistocene, during the glacial low stands, this whole shelf was actually exposed. There was these rivers with that fish were all draining towards the South China Sea here, and at that time could freely go from this area to that area. And of course, this is still accepted today, and this whole drainage system is still called by some authors as the Molengraaf River system. Yeah, he published a lot on distributions of coral reefs. Lots of pretty maps. Corals are here in fringing corals in red, and more atoll type systems in blue. Moving to the next character, he was sort of a black sheep in Dutch geology. He had various positions. He worked for the Geological Survey for a couple of years. He was in the coal mines, had accidents, didn't like what he was doing, had quit. And he mounted, he's mostly famous for his Central Celebes, or Central Sulawesi expedition. He did some pretty daring traverses at that time. And And they're all documented in some beautiful books. A lot of it is sort of travel type stuff, not geology, but he did come up with some new observations. He came back to the Netherlands, and he was commissioned to make the first geologic map of the Netherlands East Indies by the Dutch Royal Geographic Society. He became geology professor in Amsterdam for a couple of years. Then apparently he fell out with a bunch of people. Then he kind of disappeared from geology. For some of the Indonesians, may be interesting to know that now we have a lady, Kartini, who was, you see sort of one of the Indonesian feminist national heroes. And she's made famous by a series of letters that were published around 1900. And the person that actually published these letters was the father of Eddie Abendanon. Several of the letters that were written by Kartini were addressed to Eddie. They knew each other. And she wrote him letters when he was in the Savolunto coal mines in Sumatra. Anyway, this is the first geologic map of the Netherlands Indies that Abendanon made. You see Sumatra, Java, West Borneo, they're pretty much filled out, correctly or not. Eastern Indonesia, there is still a lot of white area where nobody's been. Also, places like Sumba are unknowns in 1915. This, I'm not going to be able to talk about much, but what is significant, there are a lot of, in the early 1900s, or in the 1800s, a lot of nations mounted these oceanographic expeditions. Now there was Darwin and the Beagle, and they sailed around the world, and they did all sorts of interesting stuff. A lot of them actually stopped or came through the Indonesian waters. Here is a French ship, Uranie. It's off an island called Lavak, in the Waigeo, in West Papua, and it made they did some interesting observations on. They described some of the rocks and they measured some gravity and actually some famous larger foraminifera that have their type locality from Uranie samples. One of the more famous one is the Challenger expedition, British expedition in 1874. A lot of it was description of water masses, but they did extensive seafloor sampling, even to depths of 4,000 or 5,000 more meters, and they kind of changed the perception of what deep sea deposits look like. So here's this whole volume published in 91, and it changed the perception of how to recognize deep marine sediments. There's just spectacular pictures have come out of it. There is like 50 volumes of documentation, and use monographs of radiolaria and foraminifera and every little animal that they collected. It's absolutely spectacular set of documentation. Here is the chief scientist, Wyvil Thompson, and he actually named one of the planktonic foraminifera genuses that we still use, Hestigeraina. It's a Wyvil Thompson name from the Challenger expedition. Big expedition that are still worthwhile looking at is the Siboga expedition. These were two Dutch expeditions that were specifically aimed for Eastern Indonesia. There was Siboga in 1899 and Snellius in 1929. So here's the name after the ship. Here's the track of the Snellius. This is the oceanographic vessel, 1929. For some of you know, there's a Snellius 2 expedition in 1982. But this expedition really outlined the deep marine basins in Indonesia and how deep they actually were. Like the Weber Deep is it's more than 5 kilometers deep, and how some of the deep sea sediment, the deep sea currents run through these basins. They had actually a geologist on the ship, which was Kuhnen, and he traipsed around the islands at every chance he got and did some interesting descriptions of that. So we have to motor a little bit here. Now later in the 1900s, we start to get into the period where geology gets more serious, and where we start to build geologic maps. As I said before, in the olden days, now they did a lot of walking. A lot of these field parties were big affairs with dozens or sometimes hundreds of porters and military escorts and you name it. So this is a relatively small field party by of Mr. Johan Dijfjes in East Java in the 1930s. But even there, look at all the stuff they're carrying. A lot of it in tin cans, which to keep the bugs out. So, okay, well, it's just a lot of text we probably don't want to go through, and we kind of mentioned this. But what is kind of the only thing I'm going to mention here is in the late 1800s, early 1900s, we finally started to do some regional geologic mapping, and much of it was started by this Rogier Verbeek, but then we had some significant others like Tobler, Wingist, and Zwierzicki, and later also characters like Musper, Leupold, that you may or may not have heard of, but they did some real meticulous mapping that is still as good as it gets. This little status of mapping in 1915 by Waterschoot van der Gracht, is a Dutch geologist that was sent out to check the status of geological survey in Indonesia. And this is kind of, you see these are the areas that had been mapped and areas that had not been. And you see there's a lot of unknown in 1915. Here's a quick shot of the very earliest guys of the geological survey. These are Dutch mining engineers. They're all educated in Delft. Now that was the program. They were groomed to go to the Netherlands Indies because there was nothing to do for them in the Netherlands. So here was actually the first head of the geological survey, Cornelis de Groot, and this was kind of the crew of the first several years. And as I said before, these were mostly checking up on mineral deposits that were also already kind of known by, from native mining and what have you, and didn't come up with a whole lot of news. So, and a very interesting character, and that's a whole talk on itself. There was an West African prince that had been educated in Delft as a mining engineer, Akwasi Boachi. He and de Groot were classmates, and they didn't get along. And when de Groot became his first boss in Indonesia, if it was race discrimination or other things, but he never got a chance to do much of anything. And it's a bit of a tragic story how he finally resigned and then became a coffee planter but we should not dwell on that too much. Here's a typical example of one of the first guys, Akkeringa. He spent much of his time at the Bangka tin mines, which were where some of the geology was run by the Geological Survey. He died very early, 1863, when he was in his 30s, 34, from typhoid. But he's mostly known for his invention of a core drill, which is called an Akkeringa drill or a Bangka drill. It's a portable drilling system that allowed them to core unconsolidated sediments to a depth of several tens of meters, whereas before they were having these hollow tubes that only go down 2 or 3 meters. But here he had a system which was very important for delineating alluvial tin deposits. And I think versions of this are still being made for mineral exploration in remote areas. Here is one of his colleagues, Everwijn. He traipsed around Borneo a lot, and this is kind of the extent of the geologic knowledge in the late 1850s. It's all now looking around what's the major rivers that were easy to access. So the later generation is a bit more interesting. By this time, the survey had moved from Bogor, where they first started, to Jakarta, or as they called it at the time, Beltevreden, Menteng. And they were located in this building, which some of you probably recognize as this was the head office of the Geological Survey for about 50 years. After they moved to Bandung in 1925, it became the Lands Archive, or the National Archive. And after Indonesian independence, it remained as the National Archive buildings. And now it's a museum of Arsip Nasional, RI, you can still visit. These are some of the key guys from that second generation that actually did some with regional geology. And I'm only going to talk about Verbeek and Brouwer next. Verbeek was sort of a master mapper. He's sort of the founding father of regional geology of Indonesia. On my top 5 list of most significant geologists in Indonesia in colonial time, Verbeek probably is number 1. Now he produced these huge volumes of regional descriptions on Java, big parts of Sumatra. And he became world famous for his work on the Krakatau 1883 eruptions. After he retired, and he's sort of my example in that one too, he in retirement, he built his bibliography of publications on the Netherlands Indies, and he had an initial big work, and then this is like the 10th supplement that he kept on doing until he died. And then I did it many years later. Here is Verbeek is shown. Here is in West Sumatra in the 1880. Here's in Ambon in 1899. This is also probably one of the earliest actual photographs of geologists in action. And one interesting thing to point out here is the guy that is with him. This is a Geological Survey employee, but De Korte. He's not a geologist, but he's that surveyor, logistics head, and stuff. And 20 years later, he still goes out with the same guy. Here he is now. But he was sort of he was like Verbeek's Man Friday. And I should mention here, we talk about all these geologists, and they're all white European males. Now, there were no women. There were also no Indonesians to speak of that contributed much. But that doesn't mean that Indonesians were not important. No, they were very dependent on guys like De Korte, who looks like he's probably an Indo-European, to do a lot of the work that is associated with the surveying. So we have to scroll through this really quick because I see we're running a little low as usual. Verbeek's first job was he was sent to the Pengaron coal mine in southeast Kalimantan in 1868. Now he was supposed to run a small mine. This was the time when steamships came around, and it was decided that it was for strategic reason that they had to mine their own coal instead of buying it from Wales and other places. And this was one of the mines providing ships with coal in the around 1870. Now Verbeek was not all that interested in the mine, but he traipsed around the area, and he came up with descriptions of the regional geology. He picked up lots of fossils that he sent to experts in Europe. And that's what this book here is about, now about the Eocene fossils of Borneo. And from there he proceeded to West Sumatra. Now he mapped the area of the recent discoveries of the Ommelin coal field. And this is probably the only venture of the Geological Survey in the 1800s that actually led to commercial exploitation. Now, these mines were opened in, I forgot, it's somewhere in the late 1800s, and they're only closed maybe 10 years ago. They've been producing for a long, long time. And Verbeek was the first one to, this is where the coal beds outcrop. There are some cross sections. This is Eocene coals, the coal bearing formation. But in the process, he always put it in regional context. We moved on to further south in Sumatra, beautiful cross sections of West Sumatra. And as I said before, this is what made him famous worldwide. Within 2 years after the eruption that shook the world in 1883, he came out with this fantastic documentation of what happened to the island. This is what Krakatau looked like after the eruption. This is the outline of the volcano before, and spectacular illustrations, very detailed descriptions of the sequence of events, the scale of this destruction, and estimates of how much was erupted. He estimated it as 12 cubic kilometers of rock had been blown up into the sky in 1883. Verbeek's final report was a trip to the Moluccas. He visited a whole bunch of islands in eastern Indonesia for many years. Wrote another 800-page report, published in both Dutch and in French. One guy I was kind of liked, and it's not just because he was the founder of my geological institute, what he studied, is Brouwer. He's now truly a world-class Dutch geologist, and he made some significant contributions in the early 1900s when he was working for the Geological Survey in 1910, 1916. Then he became professor in Delft and in Amsterdam, but then mounted some significant expeditions to Sulawesi in 1929, Timor in 1937. So here's some examples of some of his papers. If you read these now 100 years later, it's like, well, this guy was pretty good. He's a good observer and a good interpreter of what it meant. And very little of it still gets read that I know of. He actually wrote a small textbook. This is the small textbook about the geology of the Netherlands Indies, the first one in English, and this is the only one that I know of before Van Bemelen's big tome. So here's Mr. Brouwer, older age. This original of this painting hung in the lecture hall where I spent many years in Amsterdam. Just some of his major works on the Sulawesi expedition, on the Timor expedition. He also wrote a couple of edited series of little booklets on how to travel, how to stay safe, and all that, on expeditions in many parts of the world. And he wrote a chapter on Netherlands Indies and had some interesting pictures on field work on Timor. There is this little flight camp carrying samples to the steamer to take home. So then the final generation. Now this is when the Geological Survey moved to Bandung, and around that same time they actually started some systematic mapping operation of Sumatra and of Java. This is the current Geological Museum in Bandung when it first opened in 1929. You see a lot of the sprawl around Bandung today is not is not here. So there's some big names, interesting names that I find. This is this Polish guy, Zwierzycki, there is Van Bemmelen, and then I picked out Musper as another person of interest. So here is a guy that many of you may not have heard of, but he actually was incredibly productive. And he's probably the second most productive geologic map maker in Indonesia after Verbeek in the colonial area. He's a Polish geologist. He worked at the survey for 24 years. He eventually was there long enough to where he reached seniority and became head of the geology department, 35, 38. Then went back to Poland and had a very eventful life after that. So this is what he looked like when he arrived. This is when he was head of the survey. This is an example of one of the map sheets that he did, and he was actually head of the Sumatra mapping operation. He also compiled a series of 1 to 1 million geology of the Netherlands Indies overview maps, like six sheets of them. Yeah, there's an interesting geotectonic map that we can. I'd like to talk about this for days, but we have to keep moving. Here's some of his work from Indonesia. He was a supporter of the NAP theory, where he says that there had these formations that have these warm tropical plants in the Permian, overlaying formations that look like they're not related, and he assumes now these are big overthrusts that came from hundreds of kilometers away. This is another one. It's a model that is no longer very popular now. They now look for as juxtaposition of different plates, but I'm not entirely convinced that there isn't still some merit to some of these NAP structure models. Van Bemmelen accepted it, but then later we had Catilli, Pulangoro, Cameron, what have you, Barber. They no longer go with this. Here's an interesting field picture. Here is Zwierzycki in the field with some of the Java mapping colleagues. This is Terhaar Dijkjes, and here is the famous vertebrate paleontologist van Koningswald that we'll show a little later. The guy went back to Poland in 1938, retired, he was 50, and he became deputy director of the Geologic Institute in Gorsel. Then, of course, the Germans invaded, and he probably helped out with hiding critical data from the institute and sabotaging some of the oil fields in southern Poland. The result was he was arrested by the Germans and ended up in Auschwitz concentration camp that you're all familiar with where they later killed hundreds of thousands of Jews. He managed to get out after about a year and a half, and was made to work in Berlin and work on geologic stuff. After the war was over, he was instrumental in rebuilding geology programs in Wrocław and Krakow. And in the process, he became this national hero. So there is books written about him. There are postage stamps dedicated to him. Here is the boulevard Joseph Zwierzycki in Polish at the university. And there's another big monument in his honor with two of what Debbie calls his groupies. These are two Polish geologist ladies that we visited a year and a half ago. Very nice. And so we went to his grave. There's the graveyard in Wrocław, which used to be the old German town of Breslau. And you noticed he died in 1961, and yet at that day in 2019, there is candles are burning and fresh flowers are laid. I don't know, there are too many geologists whose graves still are visited 60 years later. But here is Zwierzycki. Interestingly, Professor Kusumadianatha asked me about this guy a few days ago because ITB had been approached by the Polish embassy in Jakarta, asking why they didn't have a monument for Tsursiki. And one of the reasons is, well, he never was at ITB, but he was an important character at the survey. Musper, he was one of the most underappreciated geologists, I think, to have come through the Geological Survey. He mapped large areas of Sumatra, very meticulous mapping. I've used those when I worked in Stenbeck, and it was always spot on. But he had a kind of a tragic ending. So here are two of his map sheets of South Sumatra. And here's an example of his maps. And this was Stenbeck acreage later. This is the Lyric anticline. And there's some of the culminations here is the Lyric oil field, the Japura oil field, and the Ukui. Hopefully they're all on this trend. Those were oil discoveries made around 1940, probably based on Musper's maps. There's an old German guy who actually wrote a book about Musper, which is very little known, is How Far Up to Ayer Molang. And this refers to an episode in 1924. While he was doing this mapping, he and his wife and young kid actually lived in a little place called Taluk, a small village on the Indragiri River, sort of southwest of here. And it was now really the end of the world. His wife got very depressed, and she tried to kill herself. She poisoned herself after a year or 2 years. And they found her. She wasn't dead yet. And they took her to the nearest doctor, which was a 15-hour boat ride on the Indragiri River to the rubber plantation here that had a Swiss doctor, Ayer Molek. And then she died pretty much on arrival, and she's buried here. So here he was out in the end of the world with a 2-year-old daughter and no wife. Anyway, he remarried. He got back on his feet, finished his work. Some spectacular work, cross sections of parts of Sumatra. He collected a whole bunch of Eocene fish that's been described by Sanders in 1934. And one of this is actually named after Musper. Here's part of the Lahat map sheets. Some of these anticlines are oil fields, Kamping Minyak, Banjarsari. Very accurate work. What I forgot to mention, he was in 1940, he was German originally, but he had taken on Dutch nationality. In 1940, he was arrested by the Dutch when the Germans invaded the Netherlands. The Netherlands Indies government picked up. They arrested all the Germans and ones that they suspected of being Nazi sympathizers. And even though he was technically Dutch and there was no record of him being a Nazi sympathizer, he was arrested, ended up in a camp in Java, eventually got transported to Suriname just ahead of the Japanese invasion, and ended up dying there from malaria. It's a very tragic story, and it's captured in that red book that I just showed you. Yes, of course, we cannot have this conversation without mentioning Van Bemmelen. Of course, this is now somebody you're probably most familiar with. And if you're not, just read the book by Professor Ajat Sudrajat. He describes Van Bemmelen's life in great detail. He's obviously a very competent geologist. He had some good map sheets that he did in Sumatra and in Java. He was really like a big picture guy, and he had his own now tectonic theory, this undation theory, which never found much acceptance even among his colleagues in the Geological Survey. He wrote the big book of the Geology of Indonesia, commissioned by the Dutch government in 1949. You've probably all seen it. He was not afraid to go deep in his cross sections. You like doing these big crustal scale sections. A lot of theory, but a lot of it no longer stood the test of time. One of Van Bemeler's tragic things, he's always stuck to his undation theory. He never accepted plate tectonics later in life, and that of course makes you a little. He was not on the right side of history there. There's some mysterious episodes associated with Van Bemeler. Now, he continued to work for the Japanese during the Japanese occupation much later, until than his colleagues. He's photographed here with his armband. This is the sign of a Nippon worker. Now, this is like a trusted prisoner, so to say. So there's also rumors that some of his books was actually mostly written during that time, and there was a German version that was ready to be printed in Berlin. Peter de Ruyter talks about this in his thesis, or on the Geologic Survey. And so now there was always this air of, was he like a collaborator with these occupying forces more than he probably should? So that's it. And then now there was a big brouhaha in the Netherlands, but the circumstances that his wife died and how he remarried soon after in Austria, and ended up being buried here. Here's an interesting photo of Dutch geologist, and including Van Bemmelen, who is this with the head, and this is Van Koningswald. In the Dutch Geological Survey as prisoners of war, but they're still continuing to do some of the work for a while in 1943 until they were locked up permanently. This is a picture I got through Darwin Kadar. It comes from the Geologic Museum in Bandung. It's kind of interesting history there that we don't really have time to go through. Volcanology is a whole story on itself, and here are some of the names that are associated with it in the 1930s, when the Geological Survey had their own volcanology survey department. But there are, of course, a lot of volcano observers before that, like Jung, Verbeek, and others. Here's the Verbeek picture again. There's some spectacular photos in some of the old documents. Here is the Kelud volcano, East Java, after the 1901 eruption. And one of the guys to study that was Mr. Kemmerling. He did a lot of work on Kelud and a lot of other volcanoes. He was actually the instigator of the creation of a volcanology department in the Geological Survey, and he was the first head. He also got sick, and he died when he was 44 back in the Netherlands. Here is the Kelud again, a few days after a major eruption in 1919, and this major lahar system came through here that killed about 5,000 people in Blitar. Some Kemmerling sketches of how some of these volcano complexes formed. Here's another interesting tragic character, Mr. German Dr. Steen. He's seen here in Bandung in the 1930s with his staff. Here is Neumann von Padang. He's another well-known volcanologist in the 1930s. Some of Steen's work. Some of you that actually climb volcanoes, I used this little guide. It's a guide for mountain treks on Java that he wrote. Was still very useful in the 80s on how to climb the various volcanoes, pass to the top. And it really hadn't changed all that much. He also had the tragic thing. He was arrested the same day as Musper with other Germans. He was actually moved to a camp in British India in 41, and he died there from actually from cancer. The whole story of what happened in 1940 is, you know, it's a whole lecture in itself, and a very tragic one. Steyn had a big reputation when the volcano erupted in Papua New Guinea in 1937. He was asked to come out and evaluate. Here's a picture of Rabaul Harbor, where he comes back from, you know, all this ash-covered world. He's another interesting character. He was also actually a Russian refugee. He came to the Netherlands Indies as a former Russian army colonel, but he was, you know, a volcano observer for many years. And when all the Dutch were arrested, he actually became head of the Volcanological Survey. Paleontologists, you're my favorite. Lots and lots of them, and we're not going to be able to go through all of them. I'm just going to scroll through pictures because I just see what time it is. We can revisit some of this at some other time, or you can look at these pictures if ever it gets recorded on YouTube. And you can always contact me later if you want to know more. This was actually the first guy. A lot of it was the spectacular monographs on microfossils, almost all by Germans. And this is actually the first description of now Permian fossils from Timor, 1865, by a professor from Berlin, Bayrich. Big name in the Netherlands, even though he was German. He is Karl Martin. He was nicknamed the Linnaeus of the Javanese tertiary because he had these huge monographs of Java fossils in the early 1900s that he actually created his own journal series, this collection of the Geological National Museum in Leiden. So Martin also, he was not just a paleontologist, he now did his own expeditions to eastern Indonesia. Actually, he actually did one of the first geologic visits to islands like Buru in 1892. When on his 80th birthday, they published this huge volume, which was a listing of all the fossils, 9,000 fossil species known from Indonesia. This is written by his colleague in his honor, 650 pages. There has not been a work like this published since then for fossils of Indonesia. Here, when he died, now the newspapers called him the founder of paleontology in the Netherlands Indies. So lots of pretty pictures. A lot of the Germans were students of famous Carl von Zittel. I'm just going to scroll through this really quickly because we're out of time. Here's Banner, BPM geologist turned into paleontologist. He recorded some of the first Triassic fossils in eastern Indonesia. He organized the Timor Expedition in 1911 that collected tons and tons of stuff. So here is description of the geology, but it also spawned this series of paleontology of Timor, 16 volumes by his friends and all the different fossil groups, and he did the crinoids and the blastoids on this. Beautiful material that nobody can reproduce anymore today. So here are some of his colleagues, Krumbeck, Diener, on Triassic Ammonites. This guy became an expert on Permian Ammonites of Timor. Then, like many of his colleagues, he was called into the army in 1914, the beginning of World War II, and died fairly quickly after that. Some famous micropaleontologists in the early days, Brady, he described the foraminifera from Sumatra, and of course the recent foraminifera from the Challenger expedition. Indy was an early Mesozoic radiolaria guy who did work on Borneo, Bangka, Sulawesi. Charles Schlumberger described fossils from Foraminifera from New Guinea, Duvier from Borneo and Java. Now these are big names in French paleontology. These were actually English. So the macrofossils were all Germans. The microfossils were more British and French in 1900. All right, and then the Dutch got their own people. This is Father Flair became the first geologist in this geological survey, did some good work on the larger foraminifera in 1928. And he's known mainly for the development of this larger foraminifera zonation that's been, goes under the latter classification, which is, this kind of the basics of it are shown here. We had Tenzin Hawk, who was a true pioneer. He was the only, I always say he's the only Indonesian paleontologist, but he's really sort of Chinese Indonesian. He was born and raised there. His family had enough money to send him to Delft to get a degree in mining engineering. And so just some of his pictures here is shown in Delft as a student. Here he is in Bandung. He is a pioneer in calcareous nanofossils of Pliocene, Pleistocene age. Several species he named and are named after him. I did some pioneering work on Mesozoic radiolaria from eastern Indonesia, which actually his main mistake there, he thought he was dealing with tertiary material, but it's really Cretaceous. And I used to own his thesis that was with commission to his professor Brouwer, which I have since given to Tenzin Hawk's children, who still live in the Netherlands. He's known for his pioneering work on evolution of larger foraminifera, which I have used a lot when I did my thesis in Amsterdam on Cretaceous stuff. And of course, he had this tragic ending in 1945, shortly after he came out of a Japanese internment camp. He was killed by gangs in Bandung. His family, his wife and children survived. There's an interesting website of letters that were written by Tan and his family to family in the Netherlands. It's online. Some of it is in English. So, Ricky, you need to tell me. Am I going into overtime here? Can I?
No, you still have time. You still have time. That's okay.
You're okay with going a little longer?
We are okay. Enjoy your talk. That's okay.
Yeah, I can tell if there is anybody out there, so I just keep on blabbering.
No, that's okay. You still have time. That's okay. We are still
your
enjoying
time
to talk. Yeah.
I'll go quick, maybe another 10 minutes or so.
That's okay.
All right. So we had the macropaleontologist, micropaleontologist. We also had the vertebrate paleontologist and the hominid people. And of course, one of the more famous ones is Mr. Dubois, who is shown here. Here's another one. He was a medical doctor, but we were really more interested in fossils and particularly in trying to prove now Darwin's theory of evolution, of human evolution, where now he suggested that humans are actually evolved from apes, from monkeys, and Darwin and Dubois figured, well, if these apes lose their hair and become humans, that probably didn't happen in cold climates. It probably happened where it was warm. So he thought the Netherlands Indies might be a good place to start digging for them, which was kind of a remarkable idea. And what's even more remarkable, that he actually succeeded in finding what is actually some very rare fossils. So he first started digging in Sumatra in caves, then moved to caves in South Java, didn't really find anything old. And when he became familiar with the findings of Raden Saleh of these mammal fossils in Central Java, in Sangiran, he decided to move to the open field instead of in caves, and started digging the site in Trinil in around 1900. So this is, now he organized a bunch of laborers which were actually convicts, though the people were in jail, and could make a bit of a living by coming out and help digging for fossils. And so, as you all know, he managed to find bones that he described as Pithecanthropus erectus, or Java man, which has made him world famous, and it spawned incredible discussions worldwide, especially from the religious communities who thought that was sacrilege. So these are the bones he found: the skull cap with brain volume that was smaller than modern man, and then thigh bones that were straighter than apes, and which suggested that this critter was walking upright. That's, of course, assuming that these two are related to the same species, which it probably is. This material is still in Leiden, in Naturalis Museum. I happened to see it a couple of months ago. Here's a little monument that you've probably seen on several pictures. It's Dubois erected this in 1894 on the bank of the Solo River, across the Solo River from where the Trinil site where his fossils were found. And this was now to permanently mark the locality of PE, Pithecanthropus erectus, 175 meters to the east-northeast, 1891. His expedition collected tens of thousands of mammal fossils. Now, there's these big stegodon tusks and all sorts of bones of all sorts of fossils. Dubois never really, now it was all shipped to the Netherlands, to Leiden in the university, but Dubois never really was interested in any of that. All he was interested was these two little bones here. And even when he died in 1940, you look at, this is his grave, and look what's on here. Here is the skull and the thigh bones of Pithecanthropus in the Netherlands. Here's a bit of a word of warning. Now, Dubois, because he got so much criticism for his fossils and for how he interpreted it, and even though he was right, he became fairly reclusive, and he didn't want to talk to anybody. He locked the fossils away. Nobody was allowed to study them. He had paleontologists visit him from the United States and from different countries, trying to get to see the bones, and he wouldn't let them. And so he became fairly paranoid later in life. And I always thought it was a Dubois thing, but it turns out a lot of hominid fossil guys are like that. Now the fossils are very rare. They're all fighting over fossils, over the few fossils that are there. Nobody seems to agree with anybody in that world. So you have Dubois and also the stories that go about Mr. Leakey in Africa, and one of the Indonesian professors from Jogja, Teuku Jakob. They all become very protective of their material and are not very open to discussions about any of their interpretations. So if you young students ever think of a career in hominid paleontology, be prepared for it being a different world. So a few years after Dubois left, a German zoology professor and his wife wanted to continue Dubois' excavation to find more Pithecanthropus material. This they did not find new material, but they did excavate though a lot of new fossil material. Look at this skull and tusks of stegodon, for instance. They did actually document their results much better than Dubois ever did. So this is actually some of the best early documentation of these Pleistocene mammal faunas from Indonesia, published in 1911. The original guy, Professor Selenga, died just before the expedition, and his wife, Lenore, continued his work. Okay, quickly, Mr. van Koningswald. He's an interesting character. He came to the Geological Survey in Bandung in 1931 as vertebrate paleontologist, the first and only one they ever had there. Later became professor in Utrecht. And then after retirement, he moved to Frankfurt with all his toys, and they're still here. Here is van Koningswald near Trinil. He had a visitor, Weidenreich. He was a famous German-American hominid paleontologist, did a lot of work in China. He came to visit van Koningswald in Java because he had become pretty famous by then because he found a lot of additional Pithecanthropus fossils, mainly in Sangiran. And he described a little skull here, which is one of the older Pithecanthropus, but it's a skull of a child from Mojokerto in East Java. So, big name, interesting character. Here is that same little monument I talked about earlier. Here is van Koningswald. Here he is with his boss, Svirsiki. He was the head of the Geological Survey at that time, and two other geologists from the survey, Ter Haar and Dijfjes, who were part of Sviersiki's mapping team. Here's a book van Koningswald wrote in the 50s. It's been published, a lot of editions. After World War II, van Koningswald became professor in Utrecht, and he actually had two Indonesian students that did PhDs there. Here is Teuku Jacob, the one I told you about earlier, who later became professor in Jogja and wouldn't let anybody see his fossils. And here is Sartono, who also came to work with van Koningswald, and with Peter Marks, who for a short time was professor of paleontology in ITB in Bandung when the first geology department opened there around 1949 to 57 or so. Very nice guy. I used to work with him during my thesis. Van Koningswald was another one of these people. He figured that everything he found was his. Now, nowadays, if you find hominid fossils, it's usually viewed as material that's owned by the country that is found, and he viewed it as his personal property. And he trucked it along with him initially to the United States, then to Utrecht, and finally, when he retired, he brought it all to Frankfurt because Utrecht wouldn't give him the money to work in his retirement. And it's still there in the Senckenberg Museum. All right, Debbie says, wrap it up. Here's the guy that wrote about the first plant fossils. Here's an interesting story about a paleobotanist that described the Permian Cathasian tropical plants from Sumatra, Mr. Jongmans. So there's also two other specialists in my book that I'm not going to talk about, except, quickly mention this guy, Mr. Vening-Minus, world famous geophysicist who spent years and years in a submarine. He had developed his own gravimeter that allowed him to measure gravity in a submarine, in a moving vessel, that he built himself. And I don't know if you've ever been on a submarine, but these things are very tight. And this guy was almost 2 meters tall. So it must have been very uncomfortable for him to be spending all that time in that space. But it was worth it, because one of the things he identified were these zones of very high negative gravity anomalies in the Netherlands Indies. And this is kind of where the accretionary prism and is what we now call accretionary prism and trench are in Sumatra. But because of this now high negative gravity, he interpreted this is clearly out of equilibrium gravity, which he interpreted as zones of active downbuckling. And it is where he's starting to see subduction, except that they never made that jump at that time. Actually, it set things back a little. Here, this is a lot of geologists of his times in the 20s and 30s were proponents of Wegener's continental drift theory. And because it explained a lot, how fault belts formed, how ocean basins formed, and some of the biogeographic patterns that we see of, high latitude deposits in low latitudes today. So it made a lot of sense to many. But Training Minus, from his geophysical work, concluded that these basically, he concluded because of this downbuckling, he concluded that this ocean, the only way that can happen is that oceanic crust is very rigid and does not deform easily and compensate locally, which was correct. But what was then concluded from that, if oceanic crust is that rigid, how can you have continental blocks just sail through there like icebergs in water? So that's when a lot of the Dutch geologists went back to rejecting continental drift. And of course, it's not until plate tectonics theory came around and we had a way of getting rid of continental crust and a way of moving continents that things went back to. Wegener was onto something in 1950. So here's the guy that identified the Wadati-Benioff zone, the subduction. Here's earthquake belts that dipping towards the continent that now we know reflects the subduction channel. And he was actually probably the first or one of the first to see this in the Netherlands Indies. But then these Russian and Japanese guys that saw this now in the West Pacific actually got credit for the concept. I probably ought to close it. I have some stuff on the sort of the early petroleum entrepreneurs. This is Reering, who found oil in Sumatra. This guy is North Sumatra, East Java, East Kalimantan. These all spawned the oil industry in Indonesia. What's interesting is that these first guys didn't have any time for geology. They just drilled oil seeps and were happy with that. It's not until 1899 when Royal Dutch in Sumatra, they had been producing for 10, 15 years and built refineries and had tankers. When the field dried up and all their drilling ended up with dry holes, that they finally decided we need some help from geologists. And then we got some Swiss and German guys to come to the rescue. They brought with them the anticlinal theory. They say you need to drill crests of anticlines, and therefore you need to map anticlines. And these actually, Schmidt and Porro went into North Sumatra, and identified some undrilled anticlines, and then the Royal Dutch became happily ever after. Tovler, big mapper of anticlines, 1900. Okay, Debbie says, we got to turn it down. I have lots more pretty pictures, but I think I'm almost done. Okay, this now I'm really done. I knew by the time I got here to mine, there are tons of interesting stories about the mining industry and some of the characters that are in there. A lot of this more anecdotal stuff, because industry geologists are not known for doing or publishing a lot of science. So, and I'm almost done. This is more a placeholder for what I've been talking about until now is pretty much the colonial situation until World War II. Of course, there is a whole history of post-World War II, and this is something that I would like somebody else to take on. I have done some research on this, what I call the post-World War II academic restart. The Dutch never had a geology program in Indonesia before World War II. And it was not until 1949 that the ITB, which at that point was Technische Hogeschool Bandung, created their geology department, and initially staffed with mostly Dutch professors, Eckersdijk, Klompe, Marx, De Waard, Osberger. Of course, they all got kicked out in 1957 when Sukarno had another little fit with the Dutch, and this is the very first generation of students that were sort of educated by these professors, and all became sort of big names in government and in education. Now this is Sigit Sutario. He became head of the survey and Bureau of Mines. Katili became ITB professor and also Bureau of Mines head, ambassador eventually, and Professor Chia, Professor Sartono, and many other names. So that's for somebody else. Hopefully somebody else will write that history, as well as this one here. This is, of course, the 1960s and 70s when the whole world changed, when plate tectonics came along. So here we have some of the main players of the early days: Katili, Warren Hamilton, Neville Hale, Charles Hutchison. And so this is another call for somebody to write that history. So I think this is my final slide. I've used that before on other occasions. It's make the point of we can see further when we are standing on strong shoulders. We said there is this whole world of good material out there that people ought to familiarize themselves with before starting to reinvent everything. So they're all dead. This is from the Bemel's grave in Austria, but their legacy lives on in their published works. So that's really the end, and I apologize for blabbering on too much, which I usually do.
That's okay.
So if you have any comments or questions, now this is my email address. I also have a website, Ben Gorsel's List, that you can contact me through. So that's what I have.
Okay, Han, thank you very much for your important. I think this is very important documentations. Many people don't know about these names and the material that you presented, but we are very glad that you bring this to FOSI Talk. There's some people here want to ask you, if it is okay. First from Mr. Sigit Ari. Sigit Ari, you can turn on your audio to ask Han directly. Han will be very happy to answer.
Thank you, Ampu Volan. Thank you very much for the very good presentation. That's very beneficial for me, especially, and I think for us also. I just wondering, it is a full volume, so I think it will be many important thing in this bibliography. So I just want to ask about when it will be launch in this year, or I think in next year. So I think it's important for us to see that it will be launched to the public so that we can also have it someday. Thank you.
Well, yeah, thank you for that question. That is, it's actually going to help. The answer is I have no idea. I have, as I said, I have like 1,200 pages of manuscript, which obviously still needs a lot of cleanup. My plan was to go to Indonesia, like maybe September or so, and visit a couple of places and see if there was any interest in perhaps publishing it, or take it under their umbrella to distribute. And so I'm not sure right now. We won't be able to travel anytime soon, I suppose. And so I don't know how. I'm not quite sure where to go from here. I don't think it's a commercial publisher probably not interested in it. I cannot imagine it will be a bestseller, especially not with this size. But maybe some abbreviated version could be printed, and I can. Another option is for me to put it out online on a dedicated website or on my bibliography website, and just have it available as PDFs. But I'm not ready to go public quite yet, I think, but I could be in a few months perhaps. And if anybody has any suggestions as to where I could go with it, then please let me know.
Okay, thank you, Han. Thank you, Pak Sigit Ari, for the question. The second is, I think, is a comment from Mr. Munasri. Mr. Munasri is here, but he cannot talk because his speaker is he doesn't have the microphones. He said such story of the history of geoscience discovery in the Indonesian regions are almost unknown to most geological students, even geologists in Indonesia, and me too. That's because the teaching of geology generally only presents the theory and technical matters. If this story are summarized into a book, it will surely be interesting and inspiring. What for and why will I study geology? And I wish to be the first to order the book. Nasri.
I shall make a note.
Pak Munasri want to be the first one to order the book.
Hello.
Okay.
Can I make a suggestion regarding the?
Yes, of course. You can make suggestion.
I'm almost sure that the old faculty of mining engineering here at the Technical University of Delft can help with publication of a book like that, because it is very closely linked, of course, to the history of Indonesia, first of all, but also secondly, there are many names that you mentioned are also part of the, the old history, around Royal Dutch Shell, but also the mining engineering efforts, globally. So I think I would be very, well, I would expect that there are some people in the mining engineering world that would be very interested to help you with publication of this book.
Okay. Well, that's good to know. What is your name? I with my video I cannot see who is talking. What was your name?
No, I'm not on video. But
no, who's talking?
I will get hold of your email address and to send you an email.
All right, great. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you. The next question is from Gio Kaing. Pak Gio Kaing, silakan. You can turn on your audio.
Hi, am I audible?
Yeah.
I hear you. Yeah.
All right. Thank you. Thanks for the presentations, and your volumes are really well looked forward for. I remember that a few years ago I looked at the internet searching for exactly that topic, the geology of the history of geological investigations in the Netherlands is India, and I came across with a book, Hetmanwezen in the Netherlands, Oost-Indies by Peter Rauter, if I'm mistaken. And it was stated in the book that there was an effort by the Royal Geological Survey of the Netherlands to actually put together a history of not only geology part, but the main reason in the Netherlands is India. Are you part of the effort? That's first question.
Yeah, I'm not sure that there's anything ongoing now. There is a book that was published a couple of years ago, which called. Let me. I don't know if you can see this.
Yeah, we can see you.
It's in reverse.
You can see the book. Yeah.
Okay, this is a book. It's called Dutch Earth Science. This is history of earth science in the Netherlands, and one of the chapters is by Peter de Ruyter, and it's a reasonably comprehensive review of the history of geology of the Netherlands Indies. But he does in say 30 pages what I'm doing in 1200. So that's it's a different scale. But it's good. It's well written and it's interesting. But it's still fairly high level. But it's a very good introduction.
Oh, I did a book by itself. The main ways in Netherlands Oost-Indies, 1850 tot en met 1950, if I'm not mistaken. That's the book.
Okay,
and
yeah,
then, yeah, and that's good. But of course, nothing compared to what you're going to do.
Yeah, no, there is a book, and it's probably 2016, 17. Peter de Ruyter did a thesis, his doctoral thesis on the history of Mijnwezen, i.e. the Geological Survey in the Netherlands Indies, and that is finished, but that's just him doing it. It's not a cooperative effort, but it's a good story. Unfortunately, he wrote it in Dutch, and I don't know why, which doesn't really make it accessible to a lot of people in Indonesia, I guess. But that's out online. Peter de Ruyter is his name, Ruiter. If you Google that with Mijnwezen, it'll probably come up. It's online at the University of Utrecht thesis collection or whatever. So that's.
Thank you. Yeah.
Yeah, that's the history of Geological Survey and a bit of its historic context. So.
Right. If I may, I have a second question.
Yeah, that's okay.
Yeah. The second question relates to the geological or even many ways in education for Indonesians in the Dutch colonies. And you said that the first education in Indonesia was actually founded in 1949, which was technically no longer Netherlands Dutch East Indies. And why there were no Indonesians sent to Netherlands to study, only the Chinese Indonesian that you mentioned. We know that many Indonesians were sent in the early century, such as our early nationalists, but why none of them studied geology?
That is a good question, and I don't really know the answer. I know they had a fair number of Indonesians go to the Netherlands for to study like medicine, and they for law. They went to law schools and for language studies and all that. But for geology, I don't know why they never identified suitable candidates that could benefit from a Dutch or any kind European geological education when there was nothing in the country. I don't know. It's you know, as we said earlier, the Tansin Hock, his family was reasonably affluent. They had the finances to sponsor him, to pay for it. And now he obviously was qualified to go there, you know, from going through the Indonesian high school system and everything. So I don't know why more geologists couldn't have gone.
Yeah.
Yeah. It in retrospect, that is one of the no, it's not a tragedy is a big word, but there was such an enormous gap because there were no trained Indonesian geologists, you know, right after World War II, because the Dutch never bothered to do it. They trained a lot of them to be like surveyors and you know, more like support roles but not, you know, not to the academic level. And so there was a good effort made initially to make good on that in 1949, early 50s. And then when Sukarno got rid of all Dutch nationals and banned Dutch language publications and all that, it created that huge gap between the old world and the new, and it took Indonesia quite a long time to kind of work itself out of that. And I don't know if that would have been necessary, but that's how it went.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Giovanni, for the question. Thank you, Han. The next, I think, is from Peter Lan. Peter Lan is here also, yeah. Peter, you want to ask? I'll give him some comment to Han, maybe.
I think Pete already left the meeting.
Okay. But
yeah, maybe
Peter
we can
give some comment here. The next question is from.
You like my coffee mug, by the way.
Oh yeah.
yeah, but his comment is on the your presentation.
Yeah.
On the Tansin Hock and Gunung Gamping, right?
Yeah. He said there is a core in geological
Oh,
agency in Bandung.
Yeah. That's he he described it in fairly good detail in his Geology of Java book.
Yeah.
Which incidentally should be on every Indonesian geologist bookshelf. It's brilliant.
The next question is from Pak Mino, Pak Benjamin Sapii. Yeah.
Hi, friend. How are you?
Oh, Ben, very good. Long time no see.
Yeah. No, I just maybe I was having problem with my internet, but during your first presentation, I didn't catch. Are you familiar with Gigi Dozy, right?
Yeah, sure.
Yes, yeah. I think it's not in your bibliography concerning the discovery of Erzberg in 1956, right?
Actually, he is in the in my quote-unquote book, but I didn't mention him in the presentation. Yeah, he's he's a significant character in that he discovered Erzberg on his way to the snow mountains of the Karstens Peaks, right?
Yeah. I mean, just want to add that I think it should be there because it's very important, because since now Grasberg was one of the biggest ore deposit in the world too, right? So this is because of Dozy field notes in the Leiden, right? Bring Foberwiesen to do his expedition in 1960, right? So, yeah, I just wonder about it. It will be in yours, right?
Yeah. It's there. Yeah, it's he published a paper on the geology in 1937, I think, and It was interesting when I went to university in Amsterdam in probably the late 1960s or so. Mr. Doshi was like chief geologist of Shell at that time, and he came to give a talk to the students, and he mentioned, and he showed some pictures about, I discovered this big mountain of copper ore, but he specifically said, well, it's a very rich deposit, but it's so remote that it will probably never be exploited, because it's going to be too difficult and too expensive. And of course, then the Americans of Freeport didn't get that message, so they went ahead anyway, and it was a big success story.
Okay.
And then they invited Benjamin Sappi to do a PhD thesis there. Huh?
Okay, thank you, Van. Good to see you again.
Yeah.
Hopefully everything all right at Houston.
Yeah, other than we're not allowed to go out. Everything is good.
Yeah, I think they're very high in COVID too now, right?
Yeah, we are the champions.
Okay, thank you, Van.
Thank you.
Thank you.
The next question is from Kusuma. Yeah, Pak Kusuma, you can turn on your.
Okay. Okay, can you hear me?
Yes,
can you hear me?
Yeah. Good to hear from you.
Han, well, nice to see you. I'd like to ask, I have some bad connection here, but then I hear you about Rutten.
Yeah.
Because I think Rutten wrote a book on the geology of Netherlands Indies.
Yeah.
And I think that book was actually a collection of his lectures. It's called the Voordrachten. I think that's a very important book too, because I think it must be after Brouwer, or even before Van Bemmelen.
Yes. Yeah, this is the book you're talking about. Huh?
Yes, I have that book too, the Voordrachten.
Yeah.
I don't know. Probably I missed it. But did you? I didn't hear anything mentioned about
it.
No,
I quickly I was starting to run out of time, and I just scrolled through Mr. Rutten. But you're right. This is a book that came out before Van Bemmelen, and it's in Dutch. It is Presentations on the Geology of the Netherlands Indies, and I agree. It's absolutely brilliant. It's not as well illustrated and everything as Van Bemmelen is, but the content and the insights that this man had were rather amazing. To read that now, 80 years later, a lot of what he described and observed is still, it's still spot on. So, yeah, thanks for pointing that out.
But what is his experience in Indonesia actually?
He worked for a small company that did like consulting work on geologic mapping in the Netherlands Indies. So he worked in Northeast Java and in East Kalimantan and a couple other places for quite a long time, maybe 10 years or so. And then towards the end of it, his main work was he did this expedition to Seram that you're probably familiar with. He spent 2 years on Seram mapping. And then unfortunately what happened then at the end of it, he was appointed professor at the University of Utrecht, and he was the only professor there. He's probably very busy with a very heavy teaching load, and he never turned his Seram work into a book. That would have been a fantastic report if he did something you know, better document. But what did happen in World War II? He had a whole bunch of students that couldn't go anywhere for field work, so there are 4 or 5 theses, doctoral theses, of Rutten's students that took Rutten's notes and his samples and wrote, you know, thesis about parts of Ceram. So those combined, you know, give a pretty good impression of what the geology of that island is like. But yeah, he actually, you know, he has personal experience there, and but obviously a lot of what he lectured on in that green book was from literature, I guess. Is that what you were asking?
Yes, but he was never with the mine waste, he was with the petroleum industry.
No. I forget what the name of the company was. It was a small company. It's owned by some entrepreneur named Coster or something. I have it. I have it written down somewhere. But if you want, I can. How about I sent you the chapter on Rutten that I have.
But excuse me, he is also the author of the Geheimschrift der Aarde with Van der Vlerk, is it?
Oh, yeah, that is Van der Vlerk and Kuhnen, I guess. Yeah.
And not Rutten, eh?
Yeah, no, that's not Rutten. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
So but Kusuma, when is your book on the market?
Well, very shortly this month. I mean July.
Okay, that's
it will be July,
soon.
I think something like the 5th or something.
Very good.
Okay,
well
thank
done.
you.
Yeah.
Thank you, Pak Kusuma. We are very honored to have Pak Kusuma here in this FOSI talk. Very honored to have Pak Kusuma here. Thank you very much.
Yes. Lots of old friends here.
Yeah. Yeah, there are many honorable participants in here. We have Pak Awang here also. Also Pak Sindung. There are many people. Yeah. The next is, I think, from Pak Ivan Suharyogi. Yeah, you can turn on your audio, Pak Ivan. I will just read that. What about Ari Frederick Lasut and Sunu Sumosusastro? Yeah, both are Indonesian geologists in Diens van, cannot read it, Van den Mitzbu. I cannot read yeah. But he said about Ari Frederick Lasut and Sunu Sumosusastro. Yeah. Have you mentioned in your book also?
I do a little bit, but it's there's probably other people that know more about it. Well, what I do know, and I have written some of it in the chapter about their roles during World War II and shortly thereafter. Just before the war, before the Japanese occupation in 1938, 1939, so the Geological Survey had they call it like assistant geologist training program, and people like Van Bemmelen and some of the others, they were teaching a number of Indonesian employees to become now assistant geologists and eventually geologists. And Ari Lasut and Sunu Sastro, they were both in that program. And of course, when the Dutch were all locked up by the Japanese, they were, you know, the only people left standing, and they were promoted by the Japanese to become department heads and managers and what have you. Of course, Lasut disappeared to Jogja to set up, you know, a mining school in the Yogyakarta area, which was, you know, not controlled by the Dutch after 1945, and somehow he was suspected of being, an enemy of the state, and he was killed tragically for probably no good reason. Like many people were killed in those years. Sunu became head of the survey immediately after independence. They're obviously significant characters in the sort of the takeover of the survey by Indonesians, which rightly so. They do not have a big legacy of publications or survey work or stuff that I'm kind of using as the basis of important geologists, let's say.
Yeah. Okay, thank you very much, Han. I think this is the last question, from Pak Adi Maulana. Yeah, Pak Adi, you can turn on your audio, Pak.
Okay, Pak Hans, how are you?
Nice.
Nice to see you again.
Yeah, Pak Adi, everybody is here today.
Yeah. It has been a long time since our last meeting in Pantai Losari, in Makassar.
Like a year and a half or so.
Well, I really enjoy your presentation. Yeah, considering that I'm a young generation of geologists in Indonesia, so I really need to get more information on history of geology from Indonesia. So my question is related with Sulawesi again. That from your presentation, it was shown that Verbeek had published many papers, many publications on some Indonesian regions. However, I just realized that actually he never published any publication on geology of Sulawesi. But as you know that in Sulawesi, we have Pegunungan Verbeek in Sorowako area and things like that. Do you know what is the reason why they gave a name of Verbeek mountain in Sulawesi?
No, I think that this was named by I think it was Abendanon or the Saracen brothers, probably Abendanon.
Yeah, I heard about Saracen. I heard about Abendanon in Sulawesi.
Yeah. I try to remember.
Yeah, but I tried to find a publication by. Yeah.
I like to think Abendanon named those mountains Verbeek Range, but it's not because Verbeek was ever there. He was just one of the more important geologists at in 1900 when he was out there. Yeah, if you like, I can read. I have some of these Abendanon books right behind me. I'll try to see if he's the one that named it and why. But I think you're correct that I don't think Verbeek has been there, has spent much time there. He did land on Sulawesi during his final trip, his Moluccas trip, and there's probably a little bit in his Moluccas report. But it's like he visited there for a few days and that's it. He wasn't there. He didn't write big books about it. Does that answer the question?
Yeah. Actually, I just want to know because next week I will be invited as a speaker. People from Sorowako area. They want to have a seminar to discuss about the Verbeek mountain. And I just come across the idea when you make a presentation in here about the Verbeek. So I will let them know that actually Verbeek never published any publication, any specific publication on Sulawesi, geology of Sulawesi,
but I'll check what I think I have, and then I'll send you a copy of something.
Okay.
Okay. Thank
you. Good to see you.
Please send my regards to Debbie. Yep.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. Hope to see you again.
Thank you, Padi, for the question, Padi.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah.
So I see you become a big professor now and the guru of environmental disasters.
Yeah, thank you. It's all because of you, your support as well.
Really?
Yeah. Okay, I think that will be end our discussion. And there is some comment here from Pak Bob Morley, Mr. Bob Morley, and they said that they very enjoy your talk. Then from Pak Win, great presentation. Thank you for describing the shoulders of those that came before us. So they are giving a positive comment for your talk. And unfortunately, will be end of the discussions. And I'm personally very honored to have you, Han. I hope we can meet again. The last time we met is in Jakarta, in Lamigas here.
Yeah, that's right. That's long ago.
Yeah.
So,
then we hope you.
Sorry for going too long and for having some of the video problems.
No, that's okay. We are very enjoying your talk. Yeah, we have very. And then later I will record this and then I will post this video to YouTube because there are many people who cannot come in this live meeting. Then we can enjoy this talk in YouTube.
So, well, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much, and to Han especially for this remarkable presentation.
Yeah.
Hopefully, can see you in person. Maybe after COVID-19 going to normal. And then once again to you all, and we will have another FOSI talk by next week from Bob Morley. We will talk more about the palynology with Bob. And lastly, I wish you all a good rest tonight. And maybe you will going somewhere, Han, still in the morning in Houston now. And maybe see you on next Saturday. Yeah.
It's time for my Starbucks walk, but I'm afraid they just closed it.
Oh, really? Okay.
Yeah.
It's time for coffee.
Yeah, it's time. But Houston just went into another lockdown phase because the record COVID increase.
Okay.
But thank you very much, Ricky, and thank you very much, Melinda, to set this up, and maybe we can do another one sometime when you're still doing this.
Yeah, sure, Han. So have a great day in Houston.
Okay, thank you. You too.
Okay.
See you.